Hi, and welcome back to the Risk and Accounting Advisory Podcast. I'm Marc Montoro, National Technology Business Development Leader at Cherry Bekaert, and today I'm joined by Keith Jackson and Brian Kirk, who are both senior managers here in our information assurance and cybersecurity practice. Today we're going to be talking about the HITRUST Security Framework. We're going to be covering the foundational elements, starting with what it is, the available certification options, and what organizations would actually benefit from the HITRUST certification. This is really poignant to me because my clients are asking about it a lot. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from Brian and Keith here. Thanks for joining me today. Are you guys ready to get after it? Well, let's start with a level set of the discussion and an overview of HITRUST. Keith, can you help us with that?
Absolutely, Mark. Yeah, I think that's a great place to start. So the HITRUST basically is an information protection standards organization that I think began back in 2007. HITRUST, when it was originally founded, focused on addressing growing concerns around PHI, or protected health information. And so their name used to be part of an acronym that stood for Health Information Trust Alliance. But over the last several years, HITRUST has gone industry agnostic because their framework is really seeking to safeguard sensitive information across all industries and not just healthcare. And so to that end, HITRUST has developed and is maintaining this risk and compliance framework that they call the HITRUST CSF, CSF standing for Common Security Framework. And this framework, the CSF, is a certifiable framework. It's one in which organizations can demonstrate that they are in compliance with a fairly robust framework.
Interesting, because so you had mentioned, obviously, the healthcare industry here, but you also see a lot of other frameworks that may have come along with specific industries and others. How was this one developed?
Yeah, good question, Mark. So HITRUST developed what's considered a control library, and developed this library by integrating multiple regulatory requirements and best practice into a comprehensive framework, which Keith alluded to, is known as the HITRUST CSF. So this framework incorporates controls from various other authoritative sources, including HIPAA, NIST, ISO, PCI, among others. Essentially, what HITRUST did was they took all these frameworks and they went through a mapping exercise. So they mapped controls between the multiple frameworks. So take NIST to the ISO framework, and they mapped and identified common controls, and then to come up with their control library. From this control library, and we'll talk to this a little bit later when we discuss the R2 assessment, but companies are able to tailor that control set based off specific risk factors, and that's unique to the R2 assessment. But essentially, just know that companies within R2 assessment do have the ability to tailor their control activities based off risk factors from that control library. Additionally, HITRUST built in what's called control maturity model. So there's different control maturity levels based on the type of assessment. So if you're an R2 assessment, there's 5 different control maturity levels, from policy, procedure, implemented, measured, managed. Whereas if you were to do an E1 or an I1 assessment, you're only assessing against the implemented maturity model or level. Additionally, HITRUST conducts continuous updates over their assessment library. So as those updates come out to NIST, take, for example, NIST 171, recently Rev 3 was issued for 800 171. So HITRUST has a process where they'll go back, review their assessment library and see if any updates need to be made based off, any other updates that are made within the industry to those authoritative sources that they're relying upon. So that's basically how HITRUST kind of developed this framework. They took multiple other authoritative sources, mapped them, and then kind of came up with their assessment or control library. When you actually dig into an E1 or an I1 or an R2 assessment, each assessment is broken out into 19 domains, from access control to mobile device, endpoint protection, privacy, etc. So that's basically how HITRUST came up and developed their framework.
That makes sense. But, I kind of heard you talking a little bit about NIST and ISO, kind of those frameworks. I think, Keith, you even mentioned HITRUST starting in that healthcare industry and mentioning HIPAA, which was specific to protected health information. So Does that mean HITRUST is specific to the healthcare industry, Brian?
Initially, it was. So HITRUST initially developed this framework with a focus on the healthcare industry, aiming to provide a method for organizations to comply with HIPAA or high tech, for example. Over time, though, HITRUST has expanded the scope and has become, as Keith alluded to, more industry agnostic. And so the HITRUST CSF now incorporates control of some various regulatory and industry frameworks, making it applicable to sectors beyond healthcare, such as financial services and defense contracting. So while HITRUST is widely adopted within the healthcare space still, it is not limited to and can be used by organizations in various industries to manage information risk and compliance.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Brian. So, and as part of HITRUST endeavor to move away from just being healthcare industry focused to now more of an industry agnostic focus, their framework is tailored to really provide a control framework around any type of data that an organization may want to protect. And so thinking of, outside of PHI or protected health information, there's all other types of data that could be protected using the HITRUST framework. So some examples of that would be credit card information. So organizations that process credit cards that are most likely subject to PCI regulations. PCI is actually a regulatory factor that Brian alluded to earlier that could be included in your scope of your HITRUST assessment. Also, personally identifiable information, or PII, that needs to be protected. So think of various privacy regulations such as GDPR or CCPA, and just the full suite of state and federal and global privacy compliance frameworks out there. That type of data can be protected or assessed in HITRUST CSF as well. Also, non-public customer information. So here I'm kind of thinking of like the banking or financial services industry. Organizations, banks, financial institutions that are subject to FFIEC requirements or other state and federal level regulations to protect that type of data, that can be included as well. I could keep on going, but I think for time's sake and maybe for fun, I'll just do one more. But companies that need to be compliant with governmental or best practice standards. So some examples of that might be the ramps. So FedRAMP, State RAMP, Texas RAMP, all of those different regulations around cloud computing. Also, all of the different flavors of ISO that we've kind of been talking about so far. Plus NIST, so both the CSF and the new AI risk management framework as well that they've put out. So basically, the HITRUST CSF is designed to protect essentially any type of data that any organization considers important. But most importantly, it offers a certification which demonstrates that the organization is compliant with the HITRUST CSF framework as it pertains to that data.
That's a great overview. It helps us understand the what. But I guess a lot of people are trying to wonder the why. What are those benefits of getting HITRUST certified?
Yeah, so as we've kind of talked up so far, the HITRUST CSF truly is a robust and comprehensive framework. And so that HITRUST certification really demonstrates that an organization is adhering to some of the strictest requirements out there when it comes to protecting data. And so there's many benefits that could be said about HITRUST certification. I'll list a few. Brian, feel free to chime in with some others. But I think one would be helping the organization meet their regulatory requirements. So every organization is subject to certain regulatory requirements. We've talked about a handful of those already. So HIPAA, PCI, FFIEC for financial services institutions, just all of these different regulations that require information security and privacy controls over data. A HITRUST certification can help you meet those regulatory requirements. Also, providing assurance to your third parties that you are maintaining an appropriate environment for security and privacy of the data that you hold of theirs. I think another benefit of this would be from a business development perspective. It can really help differentiate an organization from their competitors. I can name a handful of examples where clients that we currently service from a HITRUST perspective have won contracts with their customers because they were HITRUST certified and their competitors were not. So I think it definitely gives you a cutting edge on that perspective as well. Something that's relatively new is cyber insurance premiums, maybe a reduction in those. HITRUST recently announced a partnership with Trium or Trium Cyber. I've only seen it written. I've never heard it said. So Brian, maybe you know the right pronunciation of that one. But they're a cyber insurance company that has partnered with HITRUST to provide a cyber insurance product that's exclusively offered to HITRUST certified organizations. And so if you obtain a HITRUST certification, you've demonstrated that you've undergone, the rigorous assessment of what is HITRUST, and therefore you can get some cyber insurance through Trium or Trium at potentially a lower cost than you could out there in the market. So those are a handful of what I see as benefits for being HITRUST certified.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. I think the two things you touched on, Keith, is really around money, right? It's whether you are going to lose it from losing clients or necessarily having to pay additional insurance coverage or anything like that. So, but Brian, that brings up one question when you're talking about the certification as a whole. Is this a one-size-fits-all type certification, regardless of your company size or maturity or the industry you're in, or are there other things that you need to be mindful of when you're going about this certification?
Yeah, so I mean, HITRUST can be right-sized to fit the needs of the organization. So a lot of times, organizations are receiving HITRUST requirements to become HITRUST certified from third parties that they're doing business with. And so, whenever we're engaging with an organization for the first time, we'll try to understand what the requirements are, where are the requirements from HITRUST, being flowed down from. And so essentially from that, then you can try to right size HITRUST. So as we kind of alluded to, there's 3 different types of assessments that you can get certified against within HITRUST. You have the E1 assessment, the I1 assessment, and the R2 assessment. In each assessment, provides varying levels of assurance. So the E1 assessment, for example, that provides a basic level of assurance that's focused on foundational cybersecurity controls. It has a fixed set of 44 controls. You move one step up to the I1 assessment. That offers moderate assurance addressing the evolving threat landscape, and that has a fixed set of 182 controls. Then you jump up to the highest level, that's the R2 assessment. The R2 assessment provides the highest level of assurance covering comprehensive risk management. And the R2 assessment, this is where you can really get into tailoring your control set based off risk factors. So when you're going through an R2 assessment, the first thing you would do is scope out that assessment. And so HITRUST has their own tool called MyCSF. That's essentially where you would conduct the assessment in. And so, one of the first things you do is there's a scoping section within MyCSF, and you fill out that scoping section. And based off various risk factors that you input within that scoping section, their tool kicks out the number of requirements that you're assessed against for an R2 assessment. So you can kind of see, it's very important that that organization, kind of takes the right approach in identifying what the appropriate level of HITRUST is, and then tailoring that control set to their needs. So if an organization, has a requirement to become, certified against the I1 assessment framework, it costs, and there's a lot of costs too that go into this. An I1 assessment versus an R2 assessment, there's a big cost difference, and there's a big level of effort required too between an E1 and R2 requiring more levels of effort. So it's very key that initially we kind of right size, scope the engagement to make sure that we're meeting the needs of the customers, and a lot of times those needs come from third party requirements. So identifying those third party requirements and then tailoring the assessment approach accordingly to meet those requirements.
Yeah, you talked about the number of controls for each of these, almost sounding like it's good, better, best. But what are the pros and cons of each of those certifications? Why does even one company want to go with one versus the other? Keith?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's definitely pros and cons to each of these, and as Brian mentioned, you want to make sure that you select the assessment that's going to best suit your needs. So, yeah, just kind of talking through those. I'll talk through them in the same order that Brian did there, from E1 to I1 to R2. Thinking about the E1, this is just kind of the baseline certification that's available. It truly is the easiest option to enter the world of HITRUST, and that's because the assessment is overall pretty limited. It's limited in the number of controls. As Brian mentioned, there's 44 controls that are in scope for that. And also the level of testing of those controls is limited as well. There's only one maturity level that's tested, and that's the implemented maturity level. So it's just testing that one maturity level for 44 controls. And so overall, the level of effort's pretty low. And also the total cost of the assessment, what you will pay HITRUST, what you will pay the assessor firm, is low compared to those other certification options. Some of the cons, I guess, would be that really the level of assurance is lower because there's only 44 of those key cybersecurity controls that are evaluated. The level of assurance that you can provide to your third parties from this report is pretty low as well. I think that's really the biggest con of that. And so therefore it might not meet whatever third-party assurance needs that you have with your current customer base. But examples of companies that would benefit from an E1 would really just be smaller organizations that have a low risk or a low complex environment, maybe has minimum information security processes in place, but needs to be HITRUST certified for whatever reason. This truly is a good kind of first step into the world of HITRUST. Moving on to the I1 now, the pros are pretty similar to the E1. It is an easy option, again, to enter HITRUST for a decently mature organization. The assessment itself, again, is pretty limited, at least as compared to the R2. The number of controls, again, is 182, so a smaller control set compared to hundreds of controls that we'll talk about here in a minute with the R2. And then also the level of testing of those controls is still limited with implemented only. And so the level of effort, the total cost is more than an I1 or more than an E1, sorry, but less than an R2. So it's really this kind of middle of the road approach there. But one other pro that's unique to this one is although it offers a 1-year certification, so this certification is only good for 1 year, HITRUST has made a way to, or what they call a rapid recertification. And so basically what that means is in year 1, you're going to test all 182 of those controls, but assuming that you've scored really well on those controls in your assessment, in year 2, that second year, you only have to test around 60 of those controls. You don't have to retest the full 182. So this I1 assessment with a rapid recertification, assuming you qualify, is a great way to save time and money and still maintain a HITRUST certification. So I think those are the pros of the I1. The cons, though, so there's a higher number of controls to comply with than the E1. So you go from 44 to 182. That's a big jump. And so that's going to increase the level of effort that's required and also the total cost associated with that certification as well. And although it does provide more assurance than an E1 assessment, it doesn't provide as much as the R2 that we'll talk about next. So just this middle of the road assurance. And so again, it may not meet whatever your current third-party assurance needs are with your existing customers. And that's one of the big things that needs to be considered as you pursue HITRUST is, do you have contractual needs? And if so, making sure you select the right certification for that. But thinking about companies that will benefit from an E1, it would really be medium to large organizations that have a moderate risk or complexity profile, companies that have a fairly established information security and privacy processes in place within their organization, and organizations that need to be compliant with HITRUST. One of the things that I'll say about that too is what we've come to see, I guess, is that you may have a contractual obligation to be HITRUST compliant or have a HITRUST certification, but the contract may not stipulate which certification level, right? So E1, I1, or R2. And when that's the case, having a E1 or an I1 would be probably the best approach because it's lower level of effort, lower cost. But organizations are now starting to reword those contracts to now push for the R2. So that's something that you would want to keep your eye on. But I guess lastly now, thinking about the R2, lots of pros here. So the R2 is the Cadillac. It is the best certification that you can have from HITRUST. It's the one that has been around since the beginning, back in 2007. It offers the highest level of assurance that HITRUST will give for any certification. As Brian mentioned, it's a risk-based approach, and so it truly is tailored to the organization based on the risk factors that they have and the scoping factors that are part of that initial process. And so you could have anywhere from 200, 300, 400, 500 plus controls, just depending on how complex your organization is and what types of regulatory factors, things like HIPAA and PCI and those privacy regulations, whatever you add to it. But one of the pros about that is HITRUST likes to say this about their product here, that you can test once and apply many. And really what that means is if you need to obtain HITRUST certification as a contractual requirement, if you're also required to comply with HIPAA, if you're also required to comply with GDPR, you can add all of those different regulatory factors into one assessment. You test it all once and you apply many. You can demonstrate that you're in compliance with each of those regulatory requirements, which is one of the great benefits of the R2. But on the cons, there's a handful of those too. So to be fair, some of the cons of an R2 assessment is really the cost and the level of effort. So because the level of assurance for the R2 is really high, the level of effort to complete the assessment and the cost to complete are generally high as well. And so, again, you could be testing 300, 400, 500 plus controls. And so it just takes more time, more effort, more money to complete that assessment. And here's the kicker. All of those controls have to be tested within a 90-day window. So it's a pretty tight window, but totally doable. But wanted to be fair and kind of present the cons there. But I guess thinking of examples of companies that would benefit from this would really be those larger organizations that have a high risk, highly complex outfit, organizations that generally are going to be more mature in their information security practices. They've got well-documented policies and procedures and the controls implemented, and organizations that are required to maintain a HITRUST certification based on contractual requirements.
So Keith, earlier on you mentioned that E1, being a first step, and then you kind of described how the level of complexity and effort that goes into an R2 assessment. One of the things we see companies doing is if they have a requirement to become certified against the R2 framework, a lot of times they'll start off with the E1 assessment first. They'll kind of map out a roadmap and say, okay, we're going to achieve our R2 certification, within 3 years. And so in year one, they may start off with the E1 assessment, and then year two, they may move to the I1 assessment. And each of these assessment types build off of one another. So a company can focus on implementing the E1 requirements, get assessed against that, and then focus on implementing the I1 requirements, get assessed against that, knowing that there's an overlap between the E1 and the I1 assessment. And then same thing between when you're stepping up from the I1 to the R2 assessment. Just wanted to kind of lay that out there, Keith, that a lot of companies sometimes when they have an R2 assessment, they may not just jump right into it because it is such a heavy lift. And so they may just kind of gradually move up the ladder from an E1 to an I1 to an R2.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's great feedback. And yeah, I mean, so that's why, HITRUST implemented these E1s and the I1 assessment. So prior to, I think it was around 2022, all that existed was the R2. And as Brian just mentioned, it's a big jump to go from non-HITRUST to HITRUST certification to an R2. And so to help make that more manageable and easy for organizations, HITRUST implemented the I1 back in, I think, 2022, and then the E1 in 2023 to make it kind of that bridge that Brian was talking about there.
That's interesting. Thanks, Brian and Keith, because you kind of touched on a couple things like wanting to be compliant or doing assessments. And that's something I've talked with a lot of clients about, especially the more mature ones that really want to do it internally or manage the process themselves. But there has to be some difference right there, right, Keith? Is there something about getting HITRUST certified that you have to do? Well, what is that path?
Yeah, absolutely. So so I'll say this. HITRUST requires organizations that are seeking certification to be assessed or evaluated by a HITRUST certified external assessor firm. So that's a lot of words, right? But basically, there's specific firms that are the only firms that are approved by HITRUST to assess organizations for certification. And so if you want to pursue HITRUST certification, you would need to contact one of those firms like Cherry Bekaert here and start that discussion. One thing that I will say, one warning, and I think everyone probably understands this, but not all assessor firms are created equal. And so you're going to want to engage a firm that's experienced, that's been around HITRUST for a while, that knows the ins and the outs, and just has a deep bench that's able to help you make sure that you obtain certification. So definitely feel free to reach out to us. I know Brian and I would love to connect with you.
No, that's great stuff. And thanks, Keith and Brian. It was some great information. It really aligned with a lot of the questions that I'm discussing with the clients and trying to help them out. So that really was helpful. Also want to thank our audience for listening. Be sure to check out www.cbh.com/events for our upcoming webinar, HITRUST CSF, a comprehensive overview. That's going to air on Tuesday, November 12th at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. This webinar is actually eligible for 2 CPE hours. So check it out if you can. Don't worry if you can't make it live. We will have a recording available on our website as well. Also, for more information on HITRUST, SOC reporting, information security, cyber risks, and mitigation strategies, visit www.cbh.com/risk. And I want to thank you again for listening. And always, please like, share, and subscribe to the Risk and Accounting Advisory Podcast. Hope to see you next time.